This podcast was recorded on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
Hello and welcome to a very special edition of The Real Story. I am Joe Hildebrand, and this week we're going to try to give you the real story behind, quite frankly, the only story on the planet at the moment, which is this escalating crisis in the Middle East. It started, of course, with the October 7 invasion of Israel by Hamas on the southern border. It then turned into a fight on Israel's northern and southern borders, with Hezbollah coming from the south of Lebanon into the north of Israel. And now it has escalated into what appears to be a war between Israel and Iran. We've steered clear of this topic largely on this podcast because, frankly, as the saner political leaders are saying, there's not much anyone in Australia can do about this. But I think we do still have to look at what is the real kind of truth of this, if you like. And I'm not talking about who's right and who's wrong. I'm talking about how we actually see this story. And it's taken me a very, very long time to realise how we need to look at this if there is going to be any progress whatsoever. And then just recently it kind of dawned on me like an epiphany. It is something that people on both sides have been failing to do. It's something obviously Hamas and Hezbollah and Israel have largely been failing to do. And I should say Benjamin Netanyahu and the coalition he's with, rather than the state of Israel itself. It is something that the players have been reluctant to do because the people who seek to benefit the most from this conflict are the ones who want to perpetuate it and get political capital from it, not the people who want to end it, despite what they may say. But I have been to Israel. I was in Israel the year before the October 7th attack. I've been to the area where that attack took place. I've been to the north of Israel and seen the Palestinian flags, seen the Hezbollah flags flying just on the other side of the border. It's a phenomenal experience. I went there as a guest of the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council, and they paid for it. They did try to make it as balanced as possible, I think. It was obviously something that they wanted to sort of showcase the legitimacy or showcase at least the complexity of the situation there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and some of the people I spoke to there, including the Palestinian Prime Minister in the West Bank, which is very different to Gaza. I also last week spoke to Tony Burke, who is the most senior minister in charge of national security in the Australian government. He is also someone who is having to defend his seat in southwest Sydney from the new Muslim Votes movement. And they are another group that is clearly trying to politicise, by their very nature, politicise the tragedy of what's happening in Palestine and the Middle East more generally. And later on in this episode, we're also going to speak to voices that haven't been heard before. This is an exclusive interview with an organisation that is coming out to Australia next month. It's called Standing Together. It is being organised by a group called the New Israel Fund. And two of the speakers who are coming out, one is an Arab Palestinian, an Israeli citizen, but an Arab Palestinian, and the other is a Jewish Israeli. And these are two people who are actually working together, and they're coming out to host a series of sort of interfaith dialogues between Jews and Muslims, most specifically, of course, but others generally, and say, look, how can we actually get together and solve this? And critically, they believe in Israeli legitimacy. They believe in Israel's right to exist, but they also believe in a two-state solution. They believe in Palestine's right to exist as well. And these are the voices that you don't normally hear. The voices in the middle that say, hang on a minute, how can we actually find a way forward? They're the ones that get drowned out by that extremist rhetoric on either side. So that is what we're going to be getting into in this episode, and it's going to be something I think you probably never heard before. So strap yourselves in and have a listen. Now, the first thing I want to talk about on this episode is the very first person or special guest we were introduced to when I went as part of a delegation on this, fact-finding or study tour of Israel. Now, full disclaimer, this was hosted and paid for by the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council. It was organised by them, but there was an attempt by them to explore both sides of the argument, and this included a trip into the West Bank and a meeting with the Prime Minister of Palestine, which is a pretty high level, high status, and pretty, dare I say it, sceptical voice in the debate over Palestinian and Israeli sovereignty. But before we got to any of that, the person we spoke to was actually an Australian now working in Israel as a negotiator at the table, as a negotiator between Israel and Palestine to try to bash out some kind of peace or some kind of settlement that would be acceptable to both of them. And he's someone who, got very close at times, and then of course these agreements would fall apart, or there would be no, acceptance on one side that the other side was being legitimate in what they were saying. I'm putting all that aside at the moment. The first thing he said to me, though, and the group of us, was that in order to be a negotiator, the first thing you had to do, and this guy is absolute top level one, if not the top level one. And you kind of think, man, if he can't negotiate a peace, then God help the rest of us. But the first thing he said, and I didn't understand it at the time, was that to be a negotiator like this, you actually have to be almost more like a counsellor. You have to be able to deal with and understand not politics, but personal trauma. And this is the thing that finally dawned on me in recent days as I was speaking to other people about it in the Australian community. And I'm broadcasting to you this week from Melbourne, where I've just come down for a funeral. So maybe everything's sort of just falling into place and scales are finally peeling back from my eyes. But the minute you dress up the Israeli-Palestine conflict as a political problem to be solved, you have ensured that you will not solve it. The minute you say that this is a matter of left and right, or right and wrong, or who's got history on their side, who's got the more legitimate claim, you're screwed. You will not solve this problem. And this is what this guy was trying to say to me. Now, I was as naive as everyone else when he was saying it, but I just realised it now, perhaps as the situation has escalated in the Middle East. There is no point saying, and this is where it all went wrong from the very beginning in the immediate aftermath of the October 7 attacks. This was something that was profoundly traumatic to Israel and Israelis, both the citizens of the country and the country as a whole, as well as obviously the people who were directly affected, the people who were killed, the people who were abducted, some of whom may still be alive and being held as hostages, and their families and their friends and their loved ones. This was not something, and you only have to think about every death that you've ever had in your life. This is not a political problem. This is not something that you immediately look around and say, all right, who's to blame for this? This is a moment of personal trauma. This is a moment of immense personal grief and tragedy and trauma to you. And if that is not understood, as this negotiator was trying to tell us, if someone doesn't get that and instead just says, well, that's what you get for being an oppressor, that's because you're an apartheid state, that's because you're on occupied territory. If that party doesn't get that, that's it. You have locked them out of the conversation. They will never understand that. And the same goes both ways, because of course, when Israel retaliated against Hamas for what happened on October 7th, it visited death upon Gaza many times over, the death toll that they suffered. Now, again, I don't want to use words like proportionate or say that, all right, well, they killed 1,000 of ours, so we'll go and kill 1,000 of theirs, and then we'll call it square. Life doesn't work like that, and to think about it in those mathematical terms is profoundly, obviously, sick and disturbing. But what you do have is you have a nation state that is anxious about whether or not it can even exist, that is surrounded by what it sees as hostile forces on all sides trying to wipe it from the planet, quite literally. And for some organisations like Hamas, that is its stated claim, hence the slogan from the river to the sea. And again, you have something not just political, and we can talk about Benjamin Netanyahu and the people he has to sidle up with in the Knesset to stay into power on one side. But again, they're the ones who are trying to make it political. What it is for Israel in responding to October 7 is in fact deeply personal. It is an an instinct for survival. It is them seeing that they've been attacked either directly as a person or the families of someone who has been killed or abducted, or as a citizen of a country that this other side wants to wipe out. And again, if you think of Australia, say, for example, being the subject of, a Chinese doctrine. Just imagine if there was some sort of, doctrine unearthed in Beijing that said, no, Australia shouldn't exist. We should just wipe it out, get rid of them all, and occupy it ourselves. Now, you could argue that's how the Palestinians feel as well. But the point being, you would not say that's a political threat over there. You would say that's a threat to my very survival. That is a threat to who I am. And just as much as that, if you are the family of a child who's been killed by a bomb or a rocket fired by Israel, you're not going to say, well, fair cop, we started it on October 7th, so it's fair enough that, and there's a tunnel underneath my house that I didn't know about and they were targeting that. And so I guess it's understandable that I'm now holding a dead child in my arms. You are never, ever, ever going to be able to think that way. And so no matter what another side says, that does not wash. And I can promise you, even in completely non-political situations when people say, oh, my child died, but I'll make sure their death wasn't in vain. That doesn't mean that their death was worth it. It never does. This is something, and again, this sounds so simple and it sounds so obvious. But as long as you are thinking about this conflict in political terms and not in personal terms, there can never be any progress from it. You are never going to be able to convince one side or the other that they are in the right and the others in the wrong, as long as someone has lost a mother, as long as someone has lost a child. Whoever has lost that child, and I say this as someone who came close to losing a child myself, you are on the side of that child. You are on the side of that, your family. And whoever is a threat to them, however incidentally, however accidentally, they will be the person you are opposed to. It is like the situation in Northern Ireland. If you are a Catholic or a Protestant, it doesn't matter how far back you go and who's on the side of right or what it is. If you're a Catholic, you and your people and your family are going to be the side you are on. Likewise, if you're a Protestant. So what does this all mean for Australia? Well, it means that if we are going to turn this into a political issue in Australia, we are not just having another political debate. We are importing that visceral, angry, traumatized tribalism. And once you've brought that in, you can't get rid of it. And that's why you've had political leaders and religious leaders out there all this week and in all the weeks before saying we do not want to bring this here. We cannot afford to bring this here. And I was visiting Tony Burke in his office in southwest Sydney last week. We sat down for a good long hour and talked about exactly this stuff. And again, the difference between what he is experiencing in his electorate has almost a quarter of the population there, a Muslim, overwhelmingly pro-Palestine, as you can imagine. But it's in a very different way that you see snot-nosed little white uni-socialists jumping up and down about it in the inner city and Greens-dominated seats. For the people who he speaks to, again, it's not a political issue. It's a personal issue. They've got family over there, loved ones over there, people in Lebanon now. There are 1 million displaced people in Lebanon now. And if you are the family of one of those displaced people in Lebanon, you are not worried about who's on the side of right or who started it. You're worried about whether your mum has got a house anymore. You're worried about how she's going to afford to put a roof over her head or how she's going to get her next meal. These are deeply personal problems for such people. And that's why I've always had so much more sympathy for people with direct links to the regions rather than people who are trying to whip up rhetoric, whip up outrage and politicise what for these people is a moment of personal trauma. And that is how we've got to think about it. And again, you would have seen this week, there's plans for a vigil on October 7 for the Jewish community to commemorate their dead on that day a year ago. And what do we have? We have people say, oh, we're going to use the same day as a vigil or a protest or a demonstration about whatever the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian struggle. No. By all means, have your demonstrations. Say what you like. But surely at this moment of personal trauma, surely at the memorial, an anniversary of the deaths of the greatest execution of Jewish people since the Holocaust, just do it on another day. Don't impose politics on that personal trauma, that real personal trauma. Because, of course, as soon as you do that, as soon as you politicize death, as soon as you politicize killing, then that legitimizes more death and more killing because you've given it an ideological justification. You've given it a political fig leaf that suddenly makes it okay. It's not okay. And that is what we've got to get back to. We've got to get back to the fact that any killing of innocents is never okay. And you have to look at everything through that frame. And that applies equally to both sides. Because ultimately, both sides are undergoing the same kind of trauma. And as long as they make it a political issue and not a personal issue, not a human issue, then neither side will ever be able to see it. And if neither side is ever able to see the suffering that is going on across the fence, across the border, in another home, then there is absolutely no way we will ever see peace in the Middle East or anywhere else. Our next guests on The Real Story are probably the most important and profound guests we've had. They're part of an organisation that is coming out to Australia next month to hold a series of talks and workshops with interfaith groups and other figures to try to promote lasting peace between Israel and Palestine. The name of the organisation is Standing Together, and it's put together by a group called the New Israel Fund Australia, which recognises, of course, the state of Israel, but also as part of a two-state solution with the state of Palestine, and is searching for, as the name suggests, new ways to find and create a lasting peace. And two of the speakers who are coming over are Dr. Shad Bishara, who is an Arab Palestinian and also an Israeli citizen, and Nadav Shafet, who is a Jewish Israeli citizen and is very active in the LGBTQI space, as well as helping to try to forge this new, and some would say, unlikely partnership. Hopefully it will be much more likely in the future. But both of you, welcome to The Real Story. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Now, you guys are coming in live as we record this from Israel, where it's early morning there. Nadav, you're in Tel Aviv. I might just quickly begin by saying, how has the recent fighting, the bombardment from Iranian missiles now affected you? Are you safe and well? And where are you at the moment?
Yeah, it has definitely affected us. Last night was absolutely terrifying. Pretty much every single person in Israel had to quickly find a safe room to protect ourselves from the Iranian attack. And I'll also say that I live in Tel Aviv, Yafo, and at the same time of the Iranian attack, there was also a terrorist attack in Yafo. So people were wondering, do you run to a shelter and risk being hit by a terrorist on the street, or do you stay in your house if you don't have a safe room and being risked by hit by an Iranian missile? And it was quite scary. So at the moment, and we can get into this later, we know that we are not feeling secure, and our government is not really providing us security. So that's kind of where I am now. And right now I'm at my father's house, actually, because he has a safe room. My own house does not have a safe room.
It's incredibly sobering. And again, as we've been saying, these are not just matters of politics to people who are involved. These are matters of intense personal anxiety, fear, often tragedy. Shad Bishara, talk us through how have you been impacted and whereabouts are you at the moment?
It's horrifying. It's really horrifying. I was at home yesterday, and then when we heard about the Iranian attack, I directly came to my girlfriend's apartment, even though she also doesn't have a shelter. But the sirens actually started on my way to while I'm driving my car, so I had to stop and I had to find a shelter in a shopping mall on my way, and then I was in the shopping mall for almost an hour, and then I continued my drive. And to be honest, yesterday it was actually a horrifying attack, but I'm 31 years old, but I witnessed endless wars already in my age, and I think nobody deserves this.
No, quite right. And you've forged this alliance. It's part of a sort of broader project to try to achieve that end. Just talk us through what standing together actually stands for and what it is you are trying to do that's different to everything that has been tried and failed in the past.
Yeah, Staying Together, we are a grassroots movement in Israel, mobilizing Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel to fight for peace, equality, and social justice. We are the largest grassroots Jewish Arab, Jewish Palestinian movement in Israel. We have 12 local chapters across the country, 14 student chapters. We're organized in cities and college campuses. We do protests, and we organize people to fight for lasting change, to fight, on the short term right now. This means ending this war, achieving a hostage release and ceasefire agreement that will bring the hostages back and end this endless cycle of bloodshed. But we also know that in the long term, we need to achieve Israeli-Palestinian peace if we want to live as free and equal and people who can, just live their lives. I think we're fed up with this war and this cycle of wars.
And obviously the mainstream, and I think the only humane and sensible position on this long term is for a two-state solution. Disturbingly, though, we know that both, often the leadership, Hamas has and we know the chance of from the river to the sea are often seen as code for getting rid of Israel altogether. Likewise, we've seen Benjamin Netanyahu and a lot of right-wingers in Israel saying, well, no, now is not the time, and arguably never will be the time for a Palestinian state or recognition of a Palestinian state. So we've actually seen, maybe it was always just lip service for those on the sort of fringes of this debate, but we've now actually seen prominent forces on both sides saying, you know what, two-state solution, that's out the window. And that, to me, sounds very disturbing from here on the other side of the world. It must be more so from where you are. Shad, I wonder if you could talk us through how, as an Arab Palestinian who's also an Israeli citizen, you support a two-state solution as does the Standing Together movement. Tell us why that is and why that is important to you as both a Palestinian and an Israeli citizen.
I mean, my narrative, and I think also the movement's narrative, believes that we have this geographical area between the river and the sea, and we know both people already live here. I mean, people that identify themselves as Palestinian Arabs and those who identify themselves as Israeli Jewish, and both of them have the right for self-determination, both of them have the right for independence, and therefore this is my narrative as well. Due to also if we look at historical context, also it shows that for both people have the right to be here. And I would say it even more clear. We are talking about approximately 7 million Palestinian Arabs, 7 million Israeli Jewish, and no one is going anywhere. No one is going to be kicked out. No one is going to find another homeland. Both of us, both sides call this place their homeland. And the only way to ensure that both sides will live safe and secure and free is with the two-state solution.
One of the things I mentioned earlier, that I went on a study trip of Israel that was sponsored by the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council, and notwithstanding people say, oh, they just do this to put pressure on you and it's all just propaganda. I felt it was much more nuanced and complex and even-handed than that. But the one thing that clearly struck me as absolutely unjustifiable by a small number of Israelis and their advocates in the Knesset is the settlement on, agreed upon Palestinian land, and that struck me as clearly against any kind of sense of goodwill or genuine aspiration for a negotiated peace. Likewise, the actions of Palestinian terrorists blowing themselves up at border checkpoints or conducting other attacks. Nadav, I might go to you. How much goodwill do you think there genuinely is on either side, the leadership especially of either side, as compared to the people on the ground who seem to be the fodder in all this? And, you think of the sort of factional rivalries between Fatah and Hamas in the West Bank and Gaza, and you think about Benjamin Netanyahu's and his Likud party having to form increasingly right-wing, ultra-conservative coalitions in order to shore up support in the parliament. The Knesset is the Israeli parliament, of course. I feel like there's a sense where neither side, the people on neither side, are being represented by their leadership, or at least their best interests are not being represented. Their lives are not being represented.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I could have said it better myself. I think it is clear that our leaderships are not representing the people. If you ask the average person in Israel-Palestine, do you just want this war to end? Do you want the hostages back? Do you want peace? Do you want to just live in prosperity? I think the answer will be yes. But unfortunately, our leadership, and we come from the position of being citizens of Israel, and we're looking first and foremost, at Netanyahu and his extreme right government, and we see that there is definitely no goodwill to make peace. On the contrary, Netanyahu and his government are pushing for endless war, for endless military control of millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and siege on Gaza. And this is one of their tactics, actually, to stay in power and to continue their rule and to continue the right-wing agenda. And this is completely in disconnect with what the people want. And time again, even today, even 1 year into this specific war, we see that the polls show that the majority of Israelis do want peace, do understand that peace is the only solution that will bring any of us security and equality and prosperity. So there is definitely a huge disconnect, but we definitely need to replace this government in order for us to advance to any sort of real solution.
And Shad, obviously the situation is a bit more complex on the Palestinian side, where again you have kind of multiple factions, different organisations. You've got Fatah, which is controlling nominally at least parts of the West Bank, and hasn't had an election for a decade, I think now or more. You've got the Gaza, where Hamas was elected in election about as long ago, and then you've got Hezbollah operating out of the south of Lebanon, where they've got some representation in the Lebanese parliament, but seem to sort of control the southern parts of the country, almost like a fiefdom, it would seem. How much do you think the Palestinian cause is being undermined by either the extremism or the self-interest of the figures that sit atop it?
In my opinion, and it's not only my opinion, it's a fact and it's a truth that we know that extremists from both sides, they feed themselves. Not so long ago, we heard that Netanyahu was handling money for Hamas for them to survive. The only thing that I'm able to think about right now, that extremists from both sides are feeding themselves, and we must find an alternative for this extremism from both sides. and talking about Fatah and talking about Hamas and talking about Hezbollah, in my opinion, as an Israeli citizen, I care about changing the fact on the ground in Israel right now, because and I don't elect in
So
the
you
West
feel like
Bank or in Ramallah.
Fatah and Hamas and Hezbollah, they're beyond your control. There's nothing you can do about them. So you're focused on changing the regime in Israel. But is it not also the problem, as you say, they feed themselves? So by the terrorist attack of October 7, which I know your organisation has been very, very involved in trying to address the trauma that caused and called that out. That gives a sort of legitimacy to Netanyahu, doesn't it? It means, see, they've attacked us, and that gives him an excuse to then unleash this horrendous amount of force in response to it. So it is a problem in that those Palestinian figureheads and those terrorist tactics give Netanyahu power that he otherwise would not have. Is that a fair assessment, do you think?
It's not only Netanyahu. We're talking about a very, very extremist government that also composed of Ben Gvir and Smotrich and people with their messianic illusions. What can you expect?
And this is another problem, isn't it? It's not just Netanyahu, but his Likud party has gone further and further to the right as it's had to forge alliances with more and more sort of extreme elements. And one you refer to as this sort of messianic element, which actually believes that, the Messiah won't come unless Israel is whole again. And so again, they're almost, that's their kind of river to the sea moment, isn't it? That we actually know there is no two-state solution. We need to get rid of Palestine and we need to reclaim Israel for the Jewish people in order to bring on the Messiah. That's a pretty hard position to negotiate with, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And to be honest, in my opinion, the government's coalition that made of Netanyahu and these two parties, is somehow Netanyahu is using them to save his chair, to save his position in the government. This is first of all. And second of all, what you're talking about, the messianic and the illusion and so on, we hear it at the beginning of the war. People are saying, we want to resettle Gaza, we want to reoccupy Gaza and so on. It's happening.
That's right, and obviously that puts political pressure on Netanyahu to do what he has done, which is basically say, I'm abandoning any sort of hope for pursuit of a two-state solution in the near future. I might come back to you, Nadav. What do you guys? You're coming out to Australia next month. What are you planning to do here, and what are you hoping to achieve?
Yeah, we are coming to Australia, Shahid and I, next month. And first and foremost, we want to just tell people about what we're doing, what the work we're doing on the ground in Standing Together in Israel. And we want to connect with our supporters. We have groups of supporters all across the world, Friends of Standing Together. You can find more information on that on our website. We want to connect with our supporters, and we want to kind of share what we're doing and gather support for and show people that in order to be to side with the people on the ground, with the Palestinians and the Jews who are being affected so horribly by this war, we can side with the Palestinians and the Jews on the ground, and that doesn't mean siding with the Israeli government or with Hamas. On the contrary, it means opposing those very, very strongly. It means opposing this war and this continued war and the military occupation of Palestinians. And it means that we do see a path forward. We do know that a different future is possible. And, in Standing Together, we kind of exemplify in a certain way that. And, Shahid and I are both members of the leadership of Standing Together, and we fight together for this different future. And, we're also personally friends. And this kind of message that we can fight together and we can change our reality together, and that we know it's possible. We want to share this.
Well, God willing, or perhaps people willing, you will succeed in that, and we will finally have some kind of lasting peace and togetherness between Israeli and Palestinian people. Dr. Shahad Bashara and Nadav Shofet, thank you so much for joining us on The Real Story.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for us this week at The Real Story. I won't bombard you with the usual stuff, but a pretty important episode. So if you like what you hear, or if you think it's important, please just share it with a friend, because the more people hear this stuff, hopefully the closer we get to something resembling peace in this goddamn crazy world. Take care, and I'll see you next week.